I know you seek a wife. My daughter is yours. For a man who had lost everything, this offer was a ghost knocking on a sealed door. Like this story and subscribe to see how a broken man and an outcast woman built a new world from the ashes of their pasts. His name was Isaac, and the silence of his life was a penance. He had built his cabin high in the granite teeth of the mountains, a place where the wind scoured the world clean and a man's thoughts were his only, constant companions. His wife, Sarah, and their infant son lay buried under a lone pine 1,000 miles and a lifetime away, taken by a fever that had swept through their settlement like a prairie fire. He had come here to forget how to feel, to let the edges of his grief be worn smooth by the abrasive repetition of survival. Each day was a litany of tasks: check the traps, chop the wood, clean the rifle. It was on one such day, with a blizzard screaming down from the peaks, that the rhythm of his life was broken. He saw them not as people at first, but as a dark, unnatural shape against the blinding white, a smudge of charcoal on clean linen. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into two figures, huddled together and already half buried by the driving snow. An old woman and a young one, their clothes thin and foreign, their faces pale with a cold that went bone deep. The younger woman looked up as he approached, her eyes dark and fierce in her gaunt face, her arm protectively around the frail shoulders of the elder. She did not plead for help. She simply watched him, a cornered animal deciding if he was a threat or a savior. Isaac felt the unwelcome stir of a long-dormant duty. He had come here to be left alone, but he was not an animal. He could not leave them to die. He lifted the old woman, her body shockingly light, and slung her over his shoulder. He looked at the girl. "Come," he said, the single word a plume of frozen air. She rose, stumbling, and followed him into the storm, back toward the life he had tried so hard to leave behind. The cabin was a single room, filled with the scent of pine smoke and solitude. He laid the old woman on his own cot by the hearth, the only place of real warmth. The girl, whose name he would later learn was Lee, stood dripping by the door, her gaze sweeping over the spare, masculine space. She noted the single cup, the single plate, the worn Bible on the mantelpiece, the small, crudely carved wooden horse next to it, coated in a thin layer of dust. Her eyes lingered on the horse, and a flicker of understanding passed through them. Isaac ignored her inspection, focusing on the immediate need. He ladled hot broth from the pot over the fire into 2 bowls. He had to help the old woman drink, her hands too weak to hold the spoon. The girl, Lee, took her bowl and drank, her eyes never leaving him, watchful and wary. For a day and a night, the blizzard raged, and the only sounds in the cabin were the howl of the wind and the old woman's shallow breathing. On the second morning, the storm broke, and a fragile, watery sunlight filled the room. The old woman, her strength briefly returned, beckoned him closer. Her name was Anne, and her voice was a dry whisper, like leaves skittering across stone. Her eyes, cloudy with age, held a sharp intelligence. She looked from her daughter to Isaac, then back again. "You are alone," she stated, not a question. "Your woman is gone." Isaac gave a curt, hard nod, his jaw tight. Anne's gaze drifted to the dusty horse on the mantel. "A child, too," he did not answer, turning away to stir the fire, the muscles in his back rigid. "I know you seek a wife," the old woman whispered, her words finding him across the small room. He stopped, his hand frozen on the poker. "My daughter is yours." Isaac turned slowly, staring at her, a cold knot of anger and disbelief tightening in his gut. She was delirious, her mind broken by the cold. He had saved them from the snow, he would not now prey on their desperation. He shook his head and walked out into the blinding snow glare, leaving her impossible words to hang in the silent, smoky air. He spent the day checking his trap lines, the physical exertion a welcome distraction from the turmoil in the cabin. The old woman's proposition was a madness born of desperation. He was a ghost, a man hollowed out by loss. He had nothing to offer a wife but the echo of a dead family and a crushing, mountain-born loneliness. He was not seeking a wife, he was seeking an ending. Yet when he returned, a dead rabbit swinging from his hand, the scene in the cabin gave him pause. Lee had not been idle. A space had been cleared, his few belongings tidied. The floor, which he had never thought of as dirty, had been swept clean with a makeshift broom of pine boughs. A pot of water was steaming over the fire, and the scent of the wild herbs she had found in his stores filled the small room. She had taken one of his oversized flannel shirts and belted it with a piece of twine. The worn fabric, meant for his broader frame, hung loosely on her, yet it could not entirely hide the slender lines of her body. She moved with a quiet, fluid grace, her silence not one of fear, but of profound self-possession. She worked without looking at him for acknowledgement, as if this was her space, her duty. Her mother, watched from the cot, a faint, knowing look in her tired eyes. Isaac hung the rabbit by the door and said nothing. He had offered them shelter from the storm, a temporary reprieve. But Lee, through her silent, steady work, was laying claim to a space in his life he had long since boarded up. She was not a guest. She was putting down roots in the barren soil of his existence, and he found himself, against all his better judgment, letting her. An unspoken arrangement was being forged in the silence, a fragile domesticity taking shape around the hearth, and he did not have the words or the will to stop it. The days that followed fell into a strange, new rhythm. Isaac would rise before dawn, his footsteps on the creaking floorboards the first sound in the cabin. He would hunt, chop wood, and clear the paths of the endless snow, reasserting his dominion over the wilderness that was always trying to reclaim his small patch of existence. When he returned, chilled to the bone, the cabin would be warm, the fire stoked, and there would be a bowl of something hot waiting for him, a thin stew of rabbit or squirrel, flavored with the strange, earthy herbs Lee seemed to find everywhere. She was a silent partner in his survival. She never spoke unless spoken to, and her answers were short, direct. But her actions spoke a language he was beginning to understand. He watched her one afternoon as she sat by the fire, mending a tear in his heavy winter coat. Her fingers, though chapped and red from the cold, were nimble and precise, her stitches small and even. He had worn that coat for 2 seasons with the rip under the arm, a constant, nagging discomfort he had never found the time or the inclination to fix. Seeing her mend it, seeing her care for his possessions with a diligence he himself lacked, sent a strange, unsettling feeling through him. It was an intimacy he had not sought, a quiet act of possession. He felt a wall within him, a carefully constructed fortress of grief, begin to crumble at the edges. He would catch himself watching her as she moved about the small room, her dark hair tied back with a strip of leather, her borrowed clothes a constant, soft reminder of their shared space. He was angry at the intrusion, angry at the flicker of warmth she ignited in the cold ashes of his heart. It felt like a betrayal of Sarah, of the life he had lost. So he retreated further into himself, his words becoming clipped, his movements abrupt. He would work until his muscles screamed with exhaustion, hoping to physically purge the unwelcome softness that was seeping into his life. But every evening, he would return to the warm cabin, to the quiet, capable presence of the woman who was slowly, silently, remaking his world. The deep cold of the high mountains was a relentless foe, and it took its final toll on the old woman. Anne's brief rally of strength faded, and she sank into a gentle decline, her life force ebbing like the winter sun. One evening, as Lee was outside gathering fresh snow to melt for water, and called Isaac to her side. Her voice was barely a whisper now, but her eyes were clear. "She is a good daughter," Anne said, her gaze fixed on the cabin door. "Her heart is strong." Isaac sat on the stool beside the cot, his large frame feeling clumsy and out of place in the presence of such fragility. He said nothing, simply waiting. "In our camp," Anne continued, her breath catching, "they work on the Great Iron Road. My husband, he died there. A rockslide." She paused, gathering her strength. "They promise my Lee to another. A good man. But he took the lung sickness. When he died, the foreman said she was bad fortune. He cast us out." With nothing, the story was told in stark, simple strokes, but Isaac could see the desperation behind it, 2 women, alone, driven into the merciless wilderness. Anne's frail hand found his, her grip surprisingly firm. "I am dying," she said, a simple statement of fact. "There is no place for a lone woman here. Not one of her kind. They will use her up and throw her away." Her eyes pleaded with him, a mother's final, desperate prayer. "I see how you live. I see the ghost in your eyes. You need a life. She needs a protector." As she coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Take her," she whispered. "Be her husband." "It is my final wish." Isaac looked at the dying woman, at the fierce, protective love that burned in her even as her own light was fading. He could not make the promise she wanted. The word husband was a brand on his soul. But he looked at the door, thinking of the silent, resilient girl on the other side. He could not offer marriage. But he could offer sanctuary. "I will not let any harm come to her," he said, his voice low and thick. "I promise you. She will be safe here for an." It was enough. A faint smile touched her lips, and she closed her eyes, her hand going limp in his, and passed in her sleep before the dawn. When Isaac woke, he knew by the profound stillness in the cabin that she was gone. Lee was already kneeling by the cot, her hand resting on her mother's. She did not weep. Her grief was a silent, stoic thing, a mirror of his own. He knew what had to be done. The ground was frozen solid, as hard as iron, but a grave had to be dug. He chose a spot on the rise behind the cabin, under a cluster of aspens that would shimmer with green in the spring. He took his pickaxe and shovel and began to work. After a few minutes, he heard the crunch of snow behind him. It was Lee. She had taken the smaller shovel he used for clearing paths. Without a word, she began to work beside him, her small frame straining against the unyielding earth. They did not speak. The only sounds were the rhythmic chink of his pickaxe against the frozen soil and the scrape of their shovels. They worked for hours, their breath pluming in the frigid air, the shared labor a conversation far deeper than words. They were partners in this grim, necessary task. When the grave was finally deep enough, he wrapped Anne's body in his cleanest blanket. He carried her to the grave, and Lee walked beside him, her head held high. After he had filled the earth back in, patting it down with the back of his shovel, Lee knelt. She spoke softly in a language he did not understand, her words a gentle, flowing prayer. And then, her duty done, she began to weep. Not loud, racking sobs, but a quiet, desperate shedding of tears, her shoulders shaking with the force of her contained sorrow. Isaac stood beside her, a silent, unmoving sentinel. He did not touch her, did not offer the empty comfort of words. He simply stood witness to her grief, his presence a solid anchor in her sea of loss. In that shared moment of mourning, on a frozen hill under a pale winter sky, the last of his resistance to her presence washed away. Weeks passed. The snows began to recede, and the first signs of a thaw appeared in the valleys. The path to the settlement, a hard 3-day walk, was now passable. The time had come. His promise to Anne had been to keep her daughter safe, and to him, that meant giving her a choice. He could not keep her here, a prisoner of his grief and this isolated landscape. She deserved a life of her own, among her own people. One morning, he packed a small rucksack for her. He filled it with dried meat, a small pouch of flint and steel, and a sharp skinning knife. He laid it on the table. "The way to town is east," he said, his voice sounding rusty and unused. "You follow the creek down out of the mountains. 3 days. There is a trading post. You can find passage on a wagon from there." He gestured to the pack. "This will be enough for your journey." He didn't look at her as he spoke, keeping his eyes on the fire, unable to face the prospect of her reaction. The cabin suddenly felt small, suffocating. He had grown accustomed to her presence, to the quiet rhythm of their shared existence. The thought of this place returning to its former state, an empty shell filled only with memories and silence, was a physical pain, a sharp twisting in his gut. He had prepared himself for this moment, had told himself it was the right and honorable thing to do. He was setting her free. But it felt like he was cutting out his own heart. He braced himself for her nod of acceptance, for the quiet gathering of her few things, for the sound of the cabin door closing behind her for the last time. He waited, the silence stretching between them, as taut as a drawn bowstring. Lee stood by the table, her small hands resting on the rough-hewn wood. She looked at the rucksack he had packed for her, then she raised her eyes to meet his. Her gaze was direct, unwavering, and in their dark depths he saw not gratitude for her freedom, but a profound, searching question. He had offered her an escape, a path back to a world he assumed she must crave. He had offered her a choice, believing he knew what she would choose. He was wrong. She held his gaze for a long moment, the silence in the cabin so complete he could hear the hiss of the sap in the firewood. Then, she turned away from the table. She walked past the pack bag, past the door that stood as a gateway to another life. She went to the corner where the brooms of pine boughs were kept, selected one, and began to sweep the hearth. The gesture was simple, mundane, yet it was the most definitive statement she had ever made. The soft, rhythmic scrape of the branches on the stone floor was her answer. It was a rejection of the path he had laid out for her and a claiming of the one she had chosen for herself. She was not leaving. This cabin, this harsh and lonely place, was her home now. Her choice. A wave of relief so powerful it made him dizzy washed over Isaac. He leaned against the stone of the fireplace, the strength suddenly gone from his legs. He had tried to do the right thing, to push her away for her own good, and she had refused to be pushed. She had seen the hollow man before her and had chosen to stay, not out of duty or desperation, but out of a will that was as strong and unyielding as the mountains around them. He watched her work, the quiet grace of her movements, and understood. He was not just her protector. She was his anchor. And in her silent, stubborn refusal to leave, she had just saved him from himself. With the spring came a great melting, a torrent of water that washed the mountains clean and brought forth a sudden, vibrant explosion of life. It was a rebirth, and it was reflected in the life within the cabin. With Lee's unspoken decision to stay, the dynamic between them shifted. The tension of uncertainty was gone, replaced by the quiet, steady work of building a life together. They were no longer just surviving the winter, they were preparing for a future. Isaac cleared a patch of land below the cabin, turning the dark, rich soil that had lain fallow for years. Lee, with a knowledge that seemed innate, planted the seeds he had bought on his last trip to the trading post, seeds he had never intended to use. She showed him which wild greens were edible, which roots could be boiled into a nourishing stew. Her quiet competence was a constant, gentle surprise. He began to build an addition to the cabin. He felled trees, hewed the logs, and began to raise a new room, a space that was not haunted by the ghosts of his past. It was a room for her. He worked with a purpose he hadn't felt in years, the rhythmic thud of his axe a heartbeat for their new life. The intimacy between them grew in the spaces between their shared tasks. It was in the way she would hand him a cup of water when he was working, their fingers brushing for a brief, electric moment. It was in the way he found himself saving the best cuts of meat for her plate. One afternoon, she was washing clothes in the creek, and the thin fabric of her dress clung to her as she rose from the water. He saw the elegant curve of her back, the strength in her shoulders, and he was struck by a powerful, protective tenderness that was so intense it almost hurt. He turned away, his heart pounding, a blush rising on his weathered cheeks. This was more than companionship. It was a slow, delicate blooming of something new, something he had never expected to feel again. The summer settled over the mountains, a warm, green blanket. The garden flourished under Lee's patient care, and the new room on the cabin was nearly complete. The life Isaac had built with her was solid, real, tangible in the neatly stacked firewood, the rows of vegetables, and the sturdy walls of their expanding home. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer a space of caution and uncertainty, but a comfortable quiet, the easy silence of two people who understood each other without the need for constant words. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and violet, Isaac sat on the new porch he had built, carving a piece of aspen wood. He was not a skilled carver, his hands more used to the brute force of an axe than the delicate work of a knife, but he worked with a focused intensity. Lee came and sat on the steps near him, mending a shirt in the fading light. He worked until the shape was complete, a small, intricately detailed flower, a mountain columbine. He had seen her admiring them on their walks to gather herbs. He sanded it smooth with a piece of sandstone and held it out to her. It was not a grand gesture. It was a small, quiet offering, a piece of his heart carved in wood. She put down her sewing and took it from him, her palm cradling the delicate object. She traced the lines of the petals with her fingertip, a slow, wondrous exploration. Then she looked up at him, and for the first time since he had known her, she gave him a full, genuine smile. It was like the sun breaking through after a long winter, a radiant warmth that lit up her entire face and struck him to his very core. He felt the last of the ice around his heart crack and melt away. He reached out, his hand hesitant, and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed her cheek. It was a question. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a beat, a silent, willing acceptance. It was her answer. The ghosts of the past were finally quiet, replaced by the promise of a future, held in a shared smile and a gentle touch.